Today we're here with two great artists, Philip Glass, composer, choreographer, Lucinda Childs, Siri Engberg from our visual art department. My name is Philip Bither, curator of performing arts, and here at a moment when tonight we'll be presenting the remount of a major work called Dance, which is a collaboration from 1979 by Philip Glass, Lucinda Childs, and Sol LeWitt. We'd like to kind of begin by just going back to that moment. And I think, I know the other night, Lucinda, you mentioned that Philip had suggested that Sol LeWitt might be an interesting collaborator. After you worked together on Stand on the Beach, you decided to make a dance. And did you ask Philip to collaborate, or did just together you decided to do a dance work? And then I'm curious about Philip, you're knowing Sol and that relationship.
I really can't remember who asked who, but I just think we just felt we wanted to do a piece together after Einstein.
Don't forget, we had been together at that point, working together for about a year and a half at least.
On Einstein.
On Einstein.
Right.
And Lucinda was not only a performer, she was doing choreography, and even in that early stage of it. So that we were thrown together into the creative process through this joint work with Bob.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know why we thought it would be fun to do something without Bob. But that wasn't really the idea. The idea was to really focus on the elements,
right.
Dance and music, which are very basic, they're core artistic genres.
And up until that point, Lucinda, you had primarily choreographed to silence, or without music.
That's right, not only to silence, but in alternative spaces. You know,
right.
Meaning not the proscenium stage.
Sure, right. And Philip, you hadn't done much with just pure dance.
I began working with dancers when I was 20.
Oh, okay.
I was at Juilliard, and
yeah.
I was writing music for Louis Horst's choreography class. Basically, the reason I did it was because the first thing I asked myself as a young composer was who wanted my music,
right.
Which is a good question, and I found out that dancers did. Almost any dancer is interested in composers because then they can work with them, and that in filmmakers. So I began working in film and dance very, very early, and I met at Juilliard at that time. It was 1956, 57. Jose Limon Company was there. The Martha Graham Company was there. We even had there are composers and theater people wandering around all the time.
Right.
I don't know if that's true so much today, but you could actually, I actually worked with those companies too. But I was basically a technician.
Right.
But I was very close to that work. I was watching it.
Right.
So I considered dance to be a sister art to music from the get-go.
And then when you decided to include a visual artist for this new collaboration together, you suggested Sol.
Did I?
Well, you knew Sol.
I did know Sol.
The
thing about Sol is he had never worked in the theater before.
I know. Huh.
It was a leap of faith. But did you know him already? Had you met him before?
I hadn't met him, but I knew, of course, his work, but I hadn't actually met Sol.
He was a little bit older than us, maybe 8 or 9 years older than us. So he was so generationally speaking, it was a generation that had achieved real success in the arts. And of that generation, he was the one that was cultivating the younger artists and the younger musicians. He was extremely interested in what we now call emerging artists. We were emerging. We were
underground.
Well, we were breaking the shell and getting out of the egg.
Right.
You know,
right.
We were just, that was the beginning. And he was extremely, he was, I would say, almost diligent in his cultivation of this younger group. Was not, the thing to remember is that the people his age or his generation, people like Jasper Rauschenberg, who were also very involved with dance,
sure.
through
with Merce,
and then with Tricia Brown and those people. They were also very involved in their career to the point where they were so involved in their career that they weren't so interested in the younger people, really and truly. I didn't think they were, but Sol was. Sol was, and he began. Well, you can talk about that. His printed matter.
That's right. I mean, he was one of the founders of printed matter, and
Why don't you say something about that? That was such an important thing.
Books and right, absolutely, and introducing this notion of a new viable art form that many artists were interested in. Actually, in thinking about the whole process of this building this piece, the three of you, I was kind of reminded of a conversation I had with Chuck Close a few years ago, where he was saying how he'd always been very frustrated with his designation by many as a photorealist, because he saw himself more akin to Sol LeWitt in the way he.
Well, he was a process artist,
actually.
He's
a process artist.
Definitely.
And this idea of building an image, in his case square by square, in LeWitt's case cube by cube or line by line. I'm curious how, is that notion of working in a modular way something that drew the three of you together initially?
Modular is, if I may say, not the best description. I think your first description was better, the process is better, because some processes are not modular. For example, if Richard Serra took a bunch of random materials and put it on the floor and made a cut through them, that was the piece. The piece was the cut. There was nothing modular about it. And that's what linked him with he actually went to school with Chuck at Yale, and linked them with, it's the idea of process. The modular business, that linked Sol with Don Judd and Bob, who's the third one?
Bob Morris?
Bob Morris, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, though he went off into other directions, but they were linked into the idea of the modular thing, and that maybe linked the music, and that maybe had something to do with Lucinda. But I think the real conceptual breakthrough was that content could be process and not subject matter. That was the idea.
And I'm curious too about this notion of seriality. So LeWitt talked a lot in the late 60s, early 70s about how Muybridge's motion studies were really influential to him in thinking about the notion of a work that could be serial in nature, that could unfold over a certain set of permutations. And I'm interested in how many visual similarities there are between the film that he made for your dance and his own thinking around that. Can you talk a bit about
Yes, well, Sol would come. He would come to the studio, and I had what is, I guess, the equivalent of a kind of a storyboard of the different sections of the dance, really mapped out. It's like an overhead map, what you would see if you were looking from above. And the whole first section is 12-count phrase, and the second section is 24-count phrase, and the next section is 48-count phrase, mixed in with some of the previous phrases. And he absolutely could follow this, and he could follow it. He could follow along with it, and I think it corresponded to his way of thinking. So that was a nice way to find a meeting point.
Siri, we had talked earlier, and I was curious, I didn't get a chance to ask you the other night, the grid pattern that exists, that we see so prominently on the film, was that something devised as a visual component of the work, or was it used in a functional way to actually map out the points?
Oh, it's absolutely a visual component, and it has to do with shifting the camera angle around the dancers. He wanted that there.
Because it does have a very three-dimensional effect when one experiences it together. I think it's fascinating that way, that it becomes a very structural element, sculptural even.
Yeah.
You had said also that when you first began to talk together, he was not interested, neither of you were interested in his creating a sculpture or something that would just be, he felt it was sort of superfluous to have just a decorative piece on stage, and that's why he gravitated to making a film.
He said that since my work was abstract and visually complex in and of itself, he didn't really understand what would be the point of some kind of drop that the dancers, well, at a certain point we did actually work with the drop before the film was ready, but the idea was that the decor should be the dancers. And therefore it's not, just some sort of decorative thing. It is the dancers. So I love that idea.
And it was the first time he had worked in film.
I
Understand.
believe
Only
so. I
time.
know he
That's
was
right.
interested, of course, in photography, but
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Well, I was totally shocked when he proposed the film. I had no
Were you?
no idea he would do that. I didn't know what he would do. We knew him to be an interesting person. It was certainly going to be interesting, but what he suggested was something which he himself had not done very much with.
And
And yet, as we see, as it turned out, it was a brilliant insight into Lucinda's work and how it worked visually. I thought it was a terrific insight.
I mean, anybody could come in and film my work.
Right.
But what Sol has done is just so amazing. I continue to, notice the excellence of what he did and the depth and the, his involvement was really extraordinary.
Well, I don't know that he did any other films.
We don't think he did.
Of any either. I mean, his work with photography existed primarily in book form. In this notion that you had to open a cover and turn pages and experience imagery and sequence, and he was very interested in that and in photographing repeated, sites or objects. But this is a real continuation of that and a real expansion of it, I think, on stage. It's a magical experience to see.
You continued to make work together, other pieces down the road, and Philip, I think there was a time I felt like when I first came to dance in the early 80s and beyond, where in small downtown venues, literally I felt like every other dance show I went to was using Philip Glass music. Were you surprised at how much postmodern dance and contemporary dance was attracted to your work, and how many?
I had gotten used to the idea that dancers they'd like things. They'd like to work with music that was energized and energized the dance, and my music certainly has that to it. I wasn't that surprised because I'd been doing it for so long.
Right.
In fact, I was a little disappointed that some of the people I admired the most never asked me. I never did a piece for Merce, and I knew him for years and years and years. I knew him all a long time. So when the big companies, and that was a big company, but also that was a downtown company.
Right.
And I knew John quite well. I actually thought that strange that I wasn't working in that as well. So I had the idea that it should be everywhere. But it wasn't everywhere. Actually, it wasn't. In point of fact, only a few choreographers really attached themselves to the music. Then later on, other people would take music that had been written and take.
Right. I think a lot of people you never even knew about.
I never even knew about. I never knew at all. Eventually, I developed, especially young dancers, people still in dance school.
Right.
I developed, but I also wanted to train them in the idea of paying composers. So what I did, I had a rule that a student performer would pay $5 a performance, but they didn't have to pay me until it got to 25. Of course, they never got to $25. So it was a way of...
Very generous of you.
Well, it was a way of training them in the relationship
Sure.
that everyone contributes to it, and that we all have just that kind of realistic thing, because many people might not have thought of that.
Right.
You know.
I thought interesting in dance as well. It was Lucinda. You did such a beautiful job of both connecting with the music, but creating a tension with it. That you said the other day, you weren't interested in mimicking Philip's music, but you wanted to create something that worked both with it, but also kind of butted up against it in a certain way. Can you talk about how when you got Philip's score and you started working with it, what your challenges were, or what your approach was to the music?
Yes, well, there's a very specific structure in Philip's music, which you can follow, and which we follow. And then it's sort of, you can deal with it on a numerically.
Would you work with the printed score when you first started?
Sometimes, and sometimes just by ear. We could follow it by ear. And then the counts that my dancers have built into that system is a way to come together with the music at certain points and to go away from the music and come back. But it's a very precise relationship of the structure of the choreography to the music.
And how did that idea work with the synchronization with the film? I mean, it's a very specific
Oh,
mirroring that's happening there.
The dancers on the film are in the exact same place in the choreography as the dancers on stage because they're all dancing to the same music, which is coming from the film. The recorded music.
It was easier to do that way first with the music. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the things that you also I found so interesting is your choices of working in pairs and, you know, the unison work, which created another kind of tension. And then you said no one ever touches, but there is this sense of these couples kind of performing together that are almost always perfectly on unison, but also sometimes just, even if they're slightly off, that creates a kind of interest as well. Would you talk maybe a little bit about, you know, how you chose the number of performers and how you decided to structure the dancers themselves in the work?
Well, there were originally 3 ensemble sections for 8 dancers, so that was 4 couples.
Right.
And 2 solo sections. And the pairing is really, they're completely in harmony with each other. They're in unison. And I feel that they're in a certain relationship that sort of opens up the space to see the dancer here doing the same thing as the dancer there, as opposed to just one dancer performing. I think it heightens the spatial relationship to the music as well.
And often I mean, they're often at a kind of angle. Right. Yeah.
No, I wouldn't put one behind
Yes, right. Yeah, right.
I feel that it opens up the space and charges the space in a way that gives a certain intensity.
Yeah. At that period in New York, in those years, I mean, a lot of writers talk about, you know, use the term minimalism. A lot of people object to the notion that these different disciplines could be lumped together in this way. But I was interested in how did the visual art world of the time influence both of you, or how did your work, you feel, have a flow back to impact the artists making sculptures and paintings at the time and things? I know, Philip, you were good friends with, you know, or are, with Richard Serra and Chuck Close and Sol. And
not only that, I worked as a studio assistant for Richard for 3 years.
Oh.
So I was actually in the studio every day. I needed a day job anyway, and he needed someone to help move stuff around. So
being immersed in that, did that impact your thinking?
I don't know whether it worked both ways.
Yeah.
It worked both ways. I introduced materials into his work that he didn't know about, like lead. He didn't.
Oh, how did you know? Because
I had worked as a plumber.
That's right. Yeah.
That's what look at the word in Latin for lead is plumb.
Huh.
No, I knew how to do that. But the thing that Richard liked about me was that I wasn't a visual artist, so that I think it's complicated to work in a studio situation where your apprentices are actually artists also, and they get involved with creating the work.
Yeah.
And they may even feel a sense of ownership of the work. I never felt any sense of ownership in Richard's work, and he found that very refreshing.
Yeah. Right.
and I didn't. I liked the work. And I would move things around and had ideas and this and that, but it didn't. I was a musician. It didn't.
Yeah,
This is, you know, it was my day job.
Right.
That's all it was. But one thing I did, I couldn't help, and through him I met a lot of other artists. And we were talking about process before. I couldn't help but notice that the work in theater and dance and music, and we were all working. We were experimenting in a way quite differently than the generation before us, people like Rauschenberg and Johns and Stella. Stella's actually closer to our age. But we were working, we were overthrowing the notion of the narrative. We were getting rid of that. What is subject matter? What is the subject of the work? I was doing pieces where the form and content were identical, like Music and Symbol and Motion. The form of the piece is actually the content of the piece. It's not that different from looking at a Jasper Johns flag painting, is it? So when you think of it that way, and then when Lucinda's working with movement, and the movement itself becomes the content. You don't need any, we were minimalist in the sense that we got down I would say rather we were essentialists rather than we got to the essence of the work. That was a better, but that was a word that I just thought of. I think I've said that word before.
Right.
When I think about it, if we look at the three of us now, Sol is about seeing, Lucinda is about moving, and I'm about hearing. But we were looking at those art forms in essential ways, where the story was an intrusion. It was a distraction from actually seeing what the work was. So we got rid of it. But getting rid of it became an enterprise that was generational. Everybody was doing it in different ways, and the variety and the ingenuity of what composers and choreographers and poets, for that matter, and sculptors did, and filmmakers. Michael Snow, by the way, was another filmmaker who we were very close to, and whose work was again, it was very much about seeing.
Right.
Yeah, wavelength.
Yeah, wavelength is what I toured with that piece for a while. I would go on tour with. I would show the movie, play music, but that made me think about when we were talking about the way he did. When you looked at the picture, by the way, when we were performing, I never got to see it because I was playing. I only got to see it in fairly recent times. I saw what he did because I was too busy performing.
Because you were performing to the film.
But when I look at it now, I see that what he was doing, he was taking the movement of Lucinda, but he was seeing it differently. The juxtaposition, it was still, the structure was there, but as if he took it and moved it around. He could move it around in a way that, because the camera can move it around.
Right.
So the act of seeing became he became, I can say, well, a collaborator, actually, which that was the idea. He fulfilled that idea far better than I think I had thought anybody could. He became a true collaborator.
Even though the film was already made.
No, it wasn't already.
Oh, so
he was filming it, but then he edited it and fooled around with it and did all kinds of things. Is that so?
There were quite a few cuts and
you're talking about Sol.
I'm talking about Sol.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
There's something oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just wondering if you came in during that process and did Sol show you more? Here's how it's looking and give feedback, or he really just
No, he didn't.
So it just appeared.
And that's what's so incredible about, I think, the work on the editing.
We said, oh my God.
Amazing.
It was a great gift to the piece. And I have to say that we weren't able to perform it with the film that much in the early days because of we needed projectors.
35 millimeter and everything.
So there were times that
It's
in this incarnation now, we're really seeing it now.
Right.
Isn't that so?
So there were times where the film was not.
That wasn't
Well,
there.
actually, at one point we were traveling with the ensemble as well, and that's very difficult to expect musicians to wear earphones or have a click track or something to keep the synchronization, because that's crucial to the piece.
It's crucial, right?
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Oh. Well, one thing I think that is so interesting in thinking about the three of you is, LeWitt was, of course, one of the first artists to be recognized within conceptual art as one who was letting go of the idea of the hand in his work, allowing work to be executed by assistants, embracing the creative license of the assistants. This idea that he would have a non-straight line, and what does that mean? When it's interpreted visually by somebody. And I'm curious how each of you thinks about that idea of kind of letting go and allowing the piece to be executed by others, and how that plays out.
Well, I haven't done that very much.
Right.
Well, I think
Symphonies and
right. I mean, there are moments.
Well,
coming from the Judson period, and certainly the influence of John Cage, the whole point is to get outside yourself and have the decision-making process take place without you necessarily personally involved, which is an enormous discipline. I mean, some people think, oh, chance, they just throw dice and it's easy. It's not easy. It involves a lot of discipline. It's very rigorous to decide where in time, where in space, when in time, and all that, and what in terms of content. So I carried that through the Judson period with me, and then we actually hit a dead end, at a certain point in time, and I felt saved by the minimalist movement, that I felt I could sort of start over again. But there was a period of almost 5 years when I didn't work at all.
You went into teaching and things?
Yeah.
I can amend my thought from that. In fact, what I did is I made music that was so difficult to play that the act of performing it was a form of surrender. You didn't. If you could just play it well, and then that was a way of getting out of yourself, because there was no. In the early music, there was no room for interpretation. Just the execution was quite demanding.
And you had to seek out, I mean, really players who were completely dedicated to...
Oh, a lot of... I didn't seek them out so much. I found interesting musicians who were out of work, which is very easy to find.
Right, right.
I often thought I had people work with me for 30 or 40 years, and I would say half-jokingly, well, I guess it's hard to get a good job in this business. Basically, we were working, and they were interested. I mean, no one would have stayed if they thought it was completely, lunatic.
Right.
Which many people did think that. They thought it was crazy music. No one thought that. But the effort required to do it was demanding, and as I can see that in the dance too. This is a very there's a lot of work that goes into this kind of performance, and in a certain way, the work separates you from from other intentions that might interfere with the making of the work itself.
Expressive intentions on the part
exactly,
of
which I have no problem doing now.
Right.
For example, the concert I did last night was full of expressive intentions.
Right. But you were in complete control.
Well, I'm not in complete control. I'm in control as much as I can get.
Right.
I still have technical limits, and I'm still working on that. I have a strategy of hiding my limitations, which is much more common. But in the early days, we didn't hide them. When the pieces broke down, that was part of what happened. We didn't even mind when they broke down. We just got up and started doing it again. Breaking down was kind of it was not intentional, but it was inevitable.
You said last night after the show that when I mentioned how nice it is to hear you play your own music, that when sometimes you hear other people play and it's so clean and kind of perfect that almost
I've rebelled against my interpreters. I decided to move the goalpost in a completely different place. So I've made it much more, but I do it partly because they're doing it for me, so I don't have to do it. Since that kind of a rigorous application to the music is taken care of by other people, that I don't need to do it, then I do something else.
Do you find sometimes those interpretations as being too perfect or too clinical or something?
I find I don't listen to them very much because it's too much like what I wrote.
Whereas the slight variations, or
they're more interesting to me. The personal, and I think that's even true for dance movements too. These aren't automatons that are dancing. These are not robots. They're human beings. And what I liked about, if I may say, about Lucinda's dance is that the body types are very different, and the movements look different on different people, and that's part of the pleasure of it, I think.
Yeah, and now there's this extra layer of the generations of 30-year difference between those dancers then.
In the film,
and the dancers.
How does that look to you?
I like it. I mean, it's very clear that it's a different group, because the dancers of those days, everybody had their own group, and even within that group, there were different styles because of their different backgrounds.
Were many of them choreographers themselves?
No, they weren't necessarily choreographers. Maybe one or two went on to be choreographers. Mostly, some of them went on to work with Cunningham or with Paula Tharp, But the dancers of today move around a lot into different companies.
Right.
So there's a certain versatility that makes them a little bit more uniform in terms of their approach to my material.
You've also talked about how much you allow almost full freedom of the use of arms, that in order for people to turn as quickly and as fully as you need them to, you don't really choreograph their arms so specifically.
The choreography is very specific in terms of the footwork and the music and everything, and the space, the relationship of each dancer in the space. But the arms originally, and working in silence, so-called silence, I was interested in what happens when you change directions. You know, not to force a position, but to find a position.
What happens naturally to your arms.
Yeah, and that you use your arms as you're turning. There's two sides of it, that you discover movement and also create a way to turn without, necessarily the preparation that you would see in ballet, like going back into fourth position and then, preparing yourself, and then the turn happens. I wanted the turn to come out of the movement, just with the idea of changing direction. So I tried to apply that a little bit to what's happening with the dancers.
Which gives it a sort of organic and also allows some of that slight individuality.
Yeah, there's some freedom. A little bit of freedom.
I'm also interested in this idea, this notion of floor patterns that you've talked about, and obviously the grid was a key part of that whole visual experience with LeWitt's juxtaposition of the film. How did those two things work with you in dance? The notion of the floor and the grid and the movement altogether.
Well, since I make sort of storyboards or scores, I call them scores, visual representation of what's happening as if it's from overhead. You see it in a way that you don't necessarily see it when you're looking at in the 3 dimensions. But that's important for me to understand how things are organized in the space. It just gives me a lot of feedback of things that I wouldn't necessarily notice or I wouldn't necessarily choose to restructure.
And you draw those patterns?
I draw them out, yes. And they have them now, actually. The Whitney Museum has some of them in their collection, which is really nice for us, and also Sol's storyboard, and some of the drawings and photos of the production.
Do you have that notation for all your works?
Pretty much, yeah.
Does the Whitney, it just has dance or has a series?
No, they just have dance.
I was curious, Philip, if you, or both of you actually, at that time, when your music was, when people were really reacting strongly in 2 directions, it seemed like there was something of a generational divide, that younger people would often be really drawn to it, and older people could sometimes couldn't figure out, had big problems with it. Was there something at that moment that was there something related to popular music at the time, or the 60s?
Well, we're talking really about a radical language, a radical shift in language. The reason it's different today is that there's younger people and not older people.
Yeah. Right.
So now they still have younger people, but now the other younger people are now middle-aged and old people.
Right.
So now I have the whole range.
Yeah.
But
which we saw last night.
But it's just they just grew up, but it didn't really change. But any time, whether it's a painter or a choreographer or a poet, begins to change the very language of the art in a very radical way, people get upset. They can't hear it, they can't see it. It sounds like nonsense. They think you're making fun of them. All kinds of things. I think there were times when we were traveling with dance that people got very upset. I think they thought this whole thing was an elaborate hoax to make them feel stupid. Isn't that's what they would get angry about it. They were angry because they thought we were making fun of them.
Right.
Actually, it never occurred to them that why would we go through all this effort?
Right.
To do that.
We
to pull the wool over your eyes.
Just to make a joke.
To fool around.
And yet, but people did think that. People got, what is the basis of the anger? That somehow their inability to understand it became a personal affront. But that was true for it's always been true. It was certainly true for Jackson Pollock. It was certainly probably true for Monet. It was probably, Van Gogh never sold one painting. His brother was an art dealer, for God's sake. I mean, this is the history of art. Yeah. Someone comes along and hears or sees or moves differently. I can imagine the early days of modern dance. People people who were devoted to ballet would, if they weren't wearing the right shoes.
Wearing no shoes at all. Right? Right.
How can that be dance?
Yeah.
Or where's the tutus?
Right.
But so this is a general, I wouldn't say a problem, it's not really a problem. It's a general response to a big shift in thinking. And it happens in poetry and dancing, music and theater.
And we still regularly get, gallery attendees who walk through the galleries and think, I could do that. What is the?
Yeah, it's a funny thing.
That's it. I could do this. Yeah.
Right.
Anybody could do this.
Right.
Well, when Pollock's first his big action paintings came out, and I was living in Baltimore, and someone in Baltimore got one of chimpanzees in the zoo gave them they made some painting. And it was published in the front page of the Baltimore Sun. Okay. So I took this. I was with glee, I took this. I took it to one of my artist friends and said, "What do you think of this painter?" And he looked at it and said, "Not a very talented painter. Who was it?" I said, "Oh, it was just a monkey in the zoo." And he said, "Well, it was clear to him it wasn't a very good painting."
Right.
But so in other words, if you don't understand the parameters of the art, then it will all look like nonsense, because it all sounds like nonsense, looks like nonsense. But anyone who works and say, "Well, this isn't very good," and one of the things that we've discovered, there was a test that was made very recently with elementary school kids. They showed them doodles that were made by artists and doodles that were made by
I heard about
non-artists or even crazy people.
Right.
Invariably, the best ones they picked were the ones they liked best were done by the artist.
By the artist. I saw that
Invariably.
study.
And yeah, so in other words, this is again another misperception of response.
Right.
There's no question that Van Gogh knew something about color. He wasn't colorblind, but he was treated like I don't know. What did people think when they saw the?
Right.
I mean,
like he was insane or something.
you think, well, if we were there, we would have bought those things and put them on the wall.
Well, one of our interests actually, because most of our programming is new work and things, and so it's a little unusual to bring a historic work like dance here. And it was met with some negative response when it was here in 1981.
Well, in defense of the people who can't accept the new work, we have to remember that the language of art is consensual. And once you break the consensus, a new consensus will get formed. But the break of that moment when the consensus is broken, and the new one, none of us, I mean, Lucinda, least of all, is not interested in making the consensus easy. She just, boom, that's it. She doesn't bring it to you gently. Yeah. So when the consensus is broken like that, there's rage and discomfort. And then, of course, it's only a question of a few years, really.
Right.
You know, you have to remember, I got to New York in 1967, 1968, 69, after I'd been away. We were at the Metropolitan Opera 9 years later.
75.
9 years later.
But you had to rent the house,
how could that
right?
be? No, we didn't rent the house.
Oh, you didn't? Oh.
That's absolutely not true. Oh. It was co-produced by the Met as a special evening. It was curated by Jane Herman and Gil Wexler.
That's an incorrect historical.
Where would we have gotten the money to rent the Met? I mean, we were totally broke.
Right.
Now we lost money, but because we didn't understand what Bob and I didn't understand, and Lucinda for that matter, I don't think you did.
And we're talking about Einstein.
Operas that sell out lose money.
Right.
We were sold out every night. We lost $10,000 a night. We were shocked.
Right.
And the Met, for all their generosity and great care with which they treated us, stuck us with that bill. That was not a rental.
Right.
That was a bad contract.
That's interesting. That really corrected a whole misunderstanding I had.
Well, that was a popular idea. But you know, I did rent the Carnegie Hall, and in 1979.
For a concert by your ensemble?
Yeah, and at 6 o'clock that night, I sold the last ticket, and it was a big relief because I could have taken a big bath that night.
So you know what we go through, and sometimes, but so you're very sympathetic to what presenters and producers.
Well, you know, look.
But I loved your story about Sue Weil because it's one of the luxuries we have at a place like the Walker is that we're not so revenue dependent.
The first night we played it was in this theater in the Round, and there
this
were
building was
5
still
people.
in construction.
There were 5 people in the audience, and Sue Weil was one of them. And after the show, she said, "That was great. I'm bringing you back next year."
She's the first curator of performance here at the Walker.
And the same thing happened when she brought in John.
Sue, yeah.
Then and probably happened with you. Her first, you know, then she went on to do Dance in America and all kinds of things.
Ran the NEA dance program and things. But you know, the notion, and I don't know whether this is working, but also one of the potential fringe benefits of presenting dance now that it is an acclaimed masterpiece and things is hoping that audiences will see it, love it, and also think, who is the artist who's 25 right now who I hate their work, but maybe there's something going on there.
Learn the lesson, this consensual language.
Right.
The language has been around long enough so that people are now familiar with it, and it can be judged now as a work of art and not as an affront to their intelligence, which of course it was.
And those reactions were fairly consistent as you, in different venues
at that time.
It was so
over
consistent.
the 2 year period,
Yeah.
79 to 81.
It was so consistent that Lucinda and I never discussed it.
Really?
We come off stage and
We were consistent about it.
it was so and the audience was booing. We never even commented. I would look at her, she would look at me, and we didn't even say a word.
Right.
Just went on to the next town.
Right.
It happened again.
Unspoken.
Well, and part of it was, I imagine, like you said, you've moved into the large concert hall and the opera house. I mean, if you were still
Well, we were in
performing
Europe.
Yeah, but in Paris, you said the response was quite negative, and
We were at the Théâtre Champs-Élysées, where Stravinsky had similar problems.
In 1913, yeah.
Not to put ourselves in that league, but at least in terms of the audience put themselves in that league. Not the work, but the audience. There was a woman I remember very well, because a woman, a very well-dressed Parisian lady, got up and said, "Ce n'est pas la danse," and she stormed out. Do you remember that?
The thing is also that coming from the modern dance tradition of Martha Graham and Jose Limon and Doris Humphrey and so forth, and and Merce Cunningham, I was calling myself a modern dancer, and there was no vocabulary, that was really, could be identified other than stripped down ballet, which was exactly what I was interested in. I wasn't interested in creating a new vocabulary. I was interested in dealing with the essentials of movement, which I found in the ballet vocabulary.
Essentialism.
What was Merce's reaction to dance?
I think I was his student. And actually, he had followed me through the Judson period, and he actually encouraged me at one point, which was for me an enormous thrill. But I think that as I moved along, and certainly into the minimalist movement, he became less enthusiastic. Because of John Cage and and that we went through evolutions, all of us, and we don't stay in the same category.
And I mean, Merce had his circle of musicians that he kind of stayed
I think they were
loyal.
very much
It was a very
dominated by
big
John
circle,
Cage.
actually, almost everybody.
Really?
He was very open-minded, except for one person. But no, he had a lot. John Gibson, a lot of people I worked with. And,
John Gibson, really?
well, he had these, you might remember, these open rehearsals.
Ah, okay.
And he had open...
when he'd do events.
He did events, and he would bring people in that were very generous that way. People could come in and play, since they wouldn't have rehearsed with the music anyway. It was a wonderful thing they did, don't you think? Those things would be on afternoons on the weekends, and these were not, I don't even announced performances really. I mean, they were at the studio, and a lot of people went through those performances.
After Einstein on the Beach, you both really entered the world. Philip really quickly and directly, and started producing, writing a lot for the opera. Was that Einstein moment? Did it open the world of opera to you both, and the notion of what can be done here with this form that maybe you had thought prior to being
not maybe I had worked in the theater from the age of 20.
With Maba Minds.
Yeah, I worked founded a theater company with these other people. Yeah. I don't think any of us thought of we were working in the world of opera. In fact, we would have meetings, and after these people would say, "Why do you think it's an opera?" That's when we decided it was an opera. I remember very clearly. But we would be sitting, the three of us, and someone would say, "Why is this an opera?" And we said, and of course that was too provocative. So we said, well, when we talked about it. But I didn't think about opera as a viable art form at all until, well, this is what I noticed. And I would say that, look, I said, to do this piece, you need a proscenium stage, you need fly space, you need wing space, you need an orchestra pit, you need people who can dance, people who can sing. You can call it anything you want to, but the only place it will fit will be in an opera house. So let's say that if it's in an opera house, it's an opera. And that was my shorthand for answering that question. But there's another answer. But there's another side to that too, which is why did I get interested in opera? Because they had all that stuff. They had orchestras, they had choruses, they had dancers, they had everybody. They had lighting designers, they had costume designers, they had everything.
So in some ways it was scale and resources that you could
It was
bring.
resources.
Yeah.
Scale, I've done a lot of very small operas for two people
Sure.
and a string quartet. Scale is a different matter, but resources, movement, image, language, movement, image, text, music, those are the four. Earth, air, fire, water, that's what it is. That will be in the theater. Opera is the one, and the funny thing is that, funnily enough, is in film that you find that same, those same modalities will be working. The different, and another common thing about
Modalities of all four of those aspects.
Text, image, text, image, movement, and music. But, and oddly enough, maybe not so oddly, opera was a popular art form, and film was a popular art form. And when we were working in opera, you were working in houses where, in Europe, a big house might be 1,200 people, but in America, it could be 2,000 or 3,000 people. We weren't working in small houses anymore. We were working in big houses. We were working in not with small sketchbooks. We were working with big canvases. So that's the other thing. And Bob became the great maestro of our time, I think. He spent a lot of time in Europe, and he's done new work. He always did new work. He went back to the repertoire, and he reinvented Madame Butterfly. He invented all this stuff. Bob, more than any of us, though he's not subject for our talk today, but he dove into that and became part of that world. I kept part of it. I know that Lucinda's worked in opera too, quite a bit, but that became his main vocation.
And Lucinda, what attracted you to opera?
Well, it's very different because I became involved in existing productions, and so I was just interesting for me.
You were first asked to choreograph.
Yes, asked to choreograph, asked to be part of a production, but I haven't actually been involved in creating an opera at all. Just working in the context of opera, which gives me the challenge of working with singers, of working with people who don't necessarily have a dance background or dance training, and it's been wonderful to find, the right movement for a singer who has to sing.
Right.
I didn't find that a limitation at all. I found that very interesting to deal with.
Did you enjoy that transition from choreographing operas to being asked to fully direct operas?
Yeah, that's been much more recent.
Yeah.
And I feel that I share with the singers a sense of being able to analyze the score and look at the music and look at how many measures they're singing and when they're not singing and how many measures is that and what they can do.
Right.
And that's something that they don't necessarily share with all directors. So I feel that that's something that gives me a connection.
And I'm sure they
that's very
appreciate
real.
it. Yeah. Were you influenced? I haven't had a chance to see any of the operas you've directed. Have your years working with Wilson and other new visionary opera directors affected your visual approach to the operas you've directed?
I think absolutely. I worked quite extensively with Luc Bondy on a number of operas. He was most recently here when they met with the Tosca, the new production of Tosca, and with Peter Stein, and I guess, of course, Bob Wilson has influenced my way of approaching being involved in opera. Yeah.
Philip, I had a question that I've always wanted to ask you, and
Uh-oh.
Well,
I'm nervous already,
when
Philip.
it's 1 o'clock in the morning and some bad commercial comes on and there's music in the background and I'm like, they're just ripping off Philip.
No, sometimes it's me.
And sometimes it may be
you.
Sure. But I think of other composers who have had an influence on the popular culture, on the culture of our times, and in earlier times, and none of them seem to have had quite as pervasive and a wide-ranging influence on just music. And I wondered if that's gratifying, or if it's sometimes irritating, or if you.
I don't pay attention to that at all, Philip. Actually, what happened is that I never became associated with an educational institution. I always made a living in music, and at a certain point, I simply had to erase the distinction between commercial and art music. Though there's a difference, but I found that, for example, when people began actually to rip off the music and put it in the commercials, we began by suing them, but then we quickly realized that all we were doing was paying lawyers to.
Right. Yeah.
It didn't do any good.
Right.
So then we said, well, then the people that worked for me went to some of the producers and said, look, instead of calling somebody else, why don't you just ask Philip to write it?
Yeah. Right.
And then
or use pre-existing.
It was simpler to do, and it was easier. It was less, and then it helped commercial music, the real difference is the function of the marketplace. When the marketplace determines what the result will be, that's commercial, and that hopefully doesn't happen in the art world of dance and theater and opera, but it does. It absolutely does. People are absolutely pleased when you sell out their houses. Only Sue Well will say, "I'll bring you back next year."
We'll get 7 next year.
but not only her, but there is a tendency, because institutions will then go to their sponsors, their patrons, and then to the National Endowment and say, well, and National Endowment is a numbers game. How many people will come to see something? So we're playing the same numbers game, but we're just calling it differently. So it's a funny line between, we've made the line very muddy in a way. But from my point of view, if I can, I have a very strict rules about this. It has to do with how much time I'll spend on it. I have a rather small amount of time I will spend.
In terms of creating new music for something.
Well, I mean, if someone asks me to do a commercial, my budget is 2 hours. No, the point is that because I have a classical formation classic, as they say, because I know harmony counterpoint analysis, because I really study that. It's very easy to do that, because that's when you have a very big technique like that, a powerful, then it's no trouble to do it. There may be social problems. Like people might be angry at you because you wrote a career, but I don't care.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't bother me. I'm not working for them.
Yeah.
The good thing about being an independent person, the way Lucinda's been and I've been, and many people remain so, is that you don't owe anybody any favors. You can do what you want.
Well, it was, in fact, I've found it in 2 different interviews. One with each of you. You talked about that moment. There were moments when you realized, hey, I made up these rules. I can break them too. And was that a time when you felt like, well, I'm using a process. I've created my work in a certain way. I need to kind of stick with that. But then there was a kind of light bulb of like,
I had a different view of that. When I talk, sometimes I do talk to students when I'm at universities, and so we're playing a concert. And the other day I was someplace in Wisconsin. Sorry.
Stevens Point.
and I was talking to, she's from Wisconsin, and I was talking to someone, and I said, I know that your big problem is you're wondering where you're going to find your voice. That's the big problem young composers have.
Were they young composers?
Oh yeah. I said, I'll tell you right now, without fail, you'll all have your voice by the time you're 30. But that's not the problem. The problem is how to get rid of it. Once you have the voice, you spend the rest of your life trying to get rid of the voice. And that's where the real
so you
growing
don't,
happens.
You mean keep repeating oneself?
Well,
or stuck in the mode.
I can't say that. For some people, going deeper and deeper into an idea is. Albers was like that with the squares.
Right.
And you can go, and Rothko was like that. I don't mean to say that that doesn't have a real value, and so there are certain people who will go deeper and deeper and deeper into one idea to the point where it becomes something splendid and unexpected. But for many of us, for me, renovating a language in the true meaning of the word, and making it new again, became always a problem for me. By the time we were doing dance, which was 1979, I'd already been through it a few times, and I had given myself permission to find other ways, and I've went over my lifetime. I've used different topics in terms of music to venture into territories that were new for me. That's why I've worked in so many different forms, opera, dance, and got away from my own ensemble, which formed a lot of my music, and which is at the heart of dance, is my own group. In the way that Lucinda you need people who, well, at least they have confidence in you,
right.
and they will go where you go. Yeah. But when I went out into the bigger world of orchestras and string quartets and people who didn't know me.
So that was an appeal, was the fact that
they were.
Oh
yes, it was, and it was difficult too. To this day, after living in New York for 50 years, I've never had work done by the New York Philharmonic. Never. 50 years I've been there.
Huh.
They themselves don't believe it. They said, we can't believe that. I said, well, believe it.
Yeah.
So this year we're doing Koyaanisqatsi, a work that's 30 years old.
Right.
So it's still not, there's a kind of resistance to ideas which are no longer really novel. They're
but the musicians have come around, haven't they? I know in the early days when you'd show an orchestra the score.
Around. No, they don't come around. The older ones die and the younger ones grow up. Milton Babbitt never liked me, then he passed away. It didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter when he was alive either, and I like his music. It's not a question of liking or disliking. There's an older generation which will never give in. And you never, I've learned that you never convince your enemies. They simply go away or they die. And then there's a new generation. And then people half your age are teaching at the conservatories. And then it's...
But it's been interesting, and it's a question for both of you. It seems like that process of rejection, of rebellion by the next generation. I mean, just looking at the audience last night, 18-year-old, rockers up to 80-year-olds.
They were there.
They were there, and there hasn't been as much, it seems, as in past eras of outright, we're moving on to our new thing, and these guys, I'm completely rejecting what your generation created.
Generational shifts.
I even think of,
let me ask you a question. Music changes very slowly. Is that true of dance?
I would say so, yes.
In Europe, it seems there's another generation like Nicole Butler who made a whole piece just called Lucinda Childs, and just 2 years ago. And there's a generation in their 30s and 40s that seem to have they've either refound your work or are completely just been inspired by it. But it's interesting that in some ways it just seems like the rejection hasn't happened as quickly or as fully in this generation. And maybe it's something about the openness of your process and the way you make it could be.
Work. We may have come to a cultural watershed in a certain way. But certainly between 1912 and they set the tone for modern music for a long time.
Right.
Till practically my generation, which is 50 years.
You mean the serialists?
And they began as the 12-tone guys. So it was 50 years of basically the same idea. That's a long time. And in the visual arts, it changed much more rapidly. That's why I think I became involved with artists, visual artists, and maybe Lucinda did too, I don't know. But they're willing to accept a modern language very quickly.
I think it's harder in the dance world, in the choreography world, because in some cases you really don't have any videos of the Judson group.
Right.
And some people think that they're changing something that has in fact already been changed. But I appreciate Nicole Butler, who is actually examining the material, and I actually worked with her.
Oh, you did?
On reconstructing some pieces from the 70s. So
right.
I appreciate that approach very much.
Mm. And also in that sort of, there was such a cultural shift in the 60s and 70s, and then rock and roll exploded, around that time, and the popular music. And Philip, your work had a big influence on a lot of the more progressive rock-based people like Eno or others who saw your work in 1970, and then rock has gotten more complex, and popular music and a bit more maybe coming a little closer to the music of what used to be called serious music, or maybe not. But
popular music is, again, you get into the marketplace and it has such a pervasive effect. It's hard to sometimes know.
Right.
But when you're talking about that, I think the writers were in the lead, actually. I think the generation in the 50s, whether it was William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg and Brian Geisen and Samuel Beckett for that matter, Genet for that matter.
Right.
I think the writers, I don't think it was, I think the 50s, I think they set the standards for modernity and for a postmodern world. And I found them to be personally inspiring.
Do both of you continue to look to literature as an inspiration? Do you still look to contemporary literature and writers?
That level of innovation has slowed down for sure. But there are writers who are,
I love Roberto Bolano, 2006. Yeah. I love that.
Well, I know we're kind of getting close to our time. Siri, did you have any last?
Well, I'm still very interested in hearing a bit more about just the general sort of vibe at Judson in the early, how, when you first came together, it was such a kind of revolutionary moment, and it was such a, unilaterally, it was a time when all of you were able to contribute equally to this, and there was not really this barrier between my discipline, your discipline. And I'm curious about how that energy kind of was synergistic for all of you. How did you all come together?
Well, it was really quite unique to have a group of young choreographers. Many of us were students at Cunningham. Some of them were actually members of the Cunningham Company, and artists like Robert Morris and Robert Rauschenberg participating. Poets.
Klaus Oldenburg was.
Philip Corner was a musician, and all of these people.
And there were these intersections
combined together. Yeah, and then what it was really a workshop situation where anybody who cared to would bring in a piece that was in any kind of shape. It didn't mean that it was completed. It was just in something to get feedback from this group that was directed also by Robert Dunn, who was a disciple of John Cage.
I think also you really have to see it as a community. We were very aware of the fact, dancers, composers, sculptors, filmmakers, we lived in the same part of town. If you went to see a new work of Göran Rainer, you could look in the audience and see, you saw artists, poets, painters, musicians. We were each other's.
You performed in gallery spaces.
Well, we lived together. Yeah. I mean, we shared a lot, and we were the audiences for each other. So we also began to trust each other, and that kind of trust spread into. It became a generational thing in a way, and as Linda said, it was the older people as well. I mean, we admired tremendously people like Rauschenberg and Johns and Merce and John Cage. We venerated them beyond anything that you can imagine, because they were way up there, and they were leading the way in a way that the academic, I would say, I say the more institutionalized, not academic, but the more institutionalized artists didn't really do that. But they were the real leaders for us, for me, and it was a social environment. We knew each other. We would see on Saturday afternoons. We all would go down to Soho and look at the galleries. It was a ritual. Everyone went to see everyone's new work, and it wasn't just painters.
Yeah.
It was all the genre of contemporary performance and plastic arts. It was all happening.
So very nurturing.
Yeah, and you mentioned people like Philip Corner and Markham Goldstein, and there were so many composers that we don't talk about today, which were so important to us. I find it painful that it gets down to a handful of people, because the real environment was far deeper than that.
What was this? It was this nexus for so many pockets of ideas, and it's such an incredible time. So.
But it should be perhaps mentioned that it was triggered by the famous Armory show of with Marcel Duchamp. Yeah. I think that was very important, triggering this whole explosion in the shingle factory.
Well, as you both continue actively to make new work and busy as ever and things, do you find? I know it's for many artists, a lot of younger artists we work with, it's a difficult time. The music industry has sort of imploded with recordings and things, and the dance touring world is facing a really tough time. But despite those things, do you feel hopeful about the creative life of, say, this country and young artists and things in the future?
Well,
Your
I
own
think
work?
it's in jeopardy. We all know that. Many of us are fighting just to protect the art form, which becomes almost a political issue, because if you have a politician saying, well, if you're so important, why don't you just find a sponsor?
Right.
And that's a problem. Also, journalists coming to me and saying, well, what would you say to a group of students that would make them want to come and see your performance? And I have to say, listen, I just don't do commercials,
Right.
I believe in advertising, I want them to know about it, but I'm just not going to go there, sorry.
Right.
So that's how I feel. But I feel that the biggest contribution in this particular day and age in the performing arts world is the performers and the performing artists themselves.
Right. I think that's true. And there's that economic factor. There's the other with the young artists. There's something which we lived through the 50s, and which I remember very clearly. The social unease of the country in the 50s was profound. We were living through McCarthy and
The level of
the whole thing. That was a very dark period. The immediate result of that was the Beat Generation, which became the opening of a whole new world of art. I believe that we're in a similar place. I think that the social malaise of the country is so deep, and that the thing that will happen, without question, will be an explosion of creativity among young people, using new technology. And I think I think we're about to see. I hope I live long enough to see it. We all do, but there will. I think it's really. I can feel it. I can feel the warm breath of it coming down on us. And there will be a generation, and there will be an explosion of new art. And now, how do I feel about myself? Well, that's going to happen, and I'm very interested, and I love it. Where am I? I'm working my. I got my potato field, and I'm working on my potatoes, and whether people like it or not, it's never really bothered me anyway.
Right.
Will I jump onto that wagon? I can't. The assumptions and that I've made about my life were made so long ago. I don't even aware of them anymore. I'm working in developing a body of work, as Lucinda is, as Sol was. On the other hand, I'm absolutely enchanted by the possibility of a whole new language, and I think it will come. It has to come. Either that or this. I mean, the only thing, in my view, that will save America, so to speak, and save our democratic ideals, which have been trounced and denounced for all the flag waving that goes on. That's the most un-American activities I've seen in decades. The only thing that will save it will be the arts. I really believe that. The culture in the highest sense, a culture that is free of commercialism and which is dedicated to a kind of idealism of art and humanity. I absolutely believe that. I've seen it before, and we're going to see it again.
That makes me feel much better.
You should. And this place that we're sitting in is going to be one of the places that happens. The Walker has always been. It's the place we came to when we were kids.
Yeah.
And the kids are going to still come. I think you've got it rebuilt just in time.
Well, I can't thank you both enough. It's been a great pleasure, and we really look forward to seeing Dance again tonight.
I do too. I'm going to see it tonight too.
Yeah.
I'm not playing anyway. I love this.
Just get to be an audience member.
I've seen it so many more times since the revival than I saw it when I think I never saw it when we were performing.
Well, and I know in this revival and tour, you've been asked to do so many interviews and had so many of these kinds of conversations. I really appreciate your taking the time to do this one. So, yeah, thanks.